What if everything you thought you knew about your life turned out to be a lie? What if the person you loved the most held a secret that could shatter your world? In this story, we dive into a chilling case that reveals the horrifying reality of a husband who uncovers a shocking truth about his wife, leading to a brutal and grisly murder. In the vibrant city of Houston, Texas, lived a couple who seemed to embody the perfect love story. Their names were David Carter and Maya Johnson. To outsiders, they were a picture-perfect couple, the kind that friends admired and strangers envied. David, a tall and muscular man with a rugged, charming smile, was a hard-working construction worker deeply rooted in his family and community. Raised in a conservative household, he held traditional values close to his heart, particularly when it came to marriage. He was known for his dedication and selflessness, often putting others' needs before his own. David was the kind of man his friends joked would take care of everyone before even thinking about himself. Maya was stunningly beautiful, with a warm brown complexion and captivating dark eyes that seemed to sparkle with life. She worked as a hairstylist and was making a name for herself in the local beauty scene. People were drawn to her infectious smile and charisma, but it was her warmth that truly set her apart. Maya had a unique way of making everyone feel special, and it wasn't long before David found himself irresistibly attracted to her. Their courtship was swift but intense, with friends and family surprised at how quickly things progressed between them. Within a few months of their first meeting at a community event organized by their local church, David proudly began bringing Maya to family gatherings, showcasing her as the one he intended to build a life with. The chemistry between them was palpable, and it wasn't long before David proposed to Maya, who accepted with tears of joy in her eyes. Their wedding day was nothing short of a fairy tale, held in the grand historic Houston Baptist Church, attended by over 200 guests. As David stood at the altar, his heart raced with excitement and love as he watched Maya glide down the aisle in a shimmering white gown, looking like a goddess. Even amidst the joy, however, there were subtle hints of unease that David brushed aside, attributing them to typical wedding day nerves. Maya seemed lost in thought at times, her gaze drifting away as if she were wrestling with something deep within. When they exchanged vows, David noticed her hands trembling slightly. He tried to dismiss it, believing it to be common anxiety on such a significant day. They embarked on a luxurious honeymoon in the Caribbean, filled with sun, sand, and endless romance. But even in paradise, David sensed Maya holding back. She would occasionally withdraw, her laughter fading into silence, her eyes clouded with an unspoken worry. After their honeymoon, David and Maya settled into a cozy home in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Houston, seeking the privacy they craved as newlyweds. David poured his energy into home improvement projects, fixing up the yard and creating a comfortable space for them. Meanwhile, Maya focused on building her beauty business, and they both envisioned a future filled with love and success. However, as weeks turned into months, David noticed subtle changes in Maya's behavior. She became increasingly secretive, often locking her phone whenever he was around, and disappearing for hours without explanation. At first, he thought she was simply busy with work, but when he dropped by her salon to surprise her, he often found it empty. Maya's excuses about late meetings with friends he had never heard of began to pile up, and David's gut feeling told him something was wrong. Despite his growing suspicions, David didn't want to believe that Maya was hiding something from him. He loved her deeply, and the thought of betrayal felt like a knife twisting in his gut. He convinced himself that he was overthinking things, that the natural stresses of married life were catching up to them, and that no relationship was perfect. But as tension mounted, intimacy between them became less frequent, and when it did happen, it felt strained. Maya often turned away, avoiding eye contact, and her demeanor hinted that she was on the verge of revealing something significant. It wasn't until one fateful night that everything unraveled. David had always respected Maya's privacy, but his growing doubts drove him to do something he never thought he would. He decided to search through her belongings while she was out with friends. As he rummaged through her drawers, he stumbled upon a small box hidden in the back of the closet, buried under piles of old clothes. Inside, he discovered documents that made his blood run cold, including a birth certificate bearing a name he had never seen before: Elijah Johnson. Confused and terrified, David dug deeper and unearthed medical records detailing Maya's transition from male to female. The weight of the revelation crashed down on him like a tidal wave, stealing the breath from his lungs. The woman he had married, the woman he had vowed to love and cherish, had kept this monumental truth from him. In that moment, he felt as if his entire world had been turned upside down. David's mind raced with conflicting emotions: anger, confusion, heartbreak, each one twisting his insides like a vice. How could Maya have hidden something so fundamental about herself? The person he thought he knew felt like a complete stranger. Hours passed in a blur of disbelief as he sat alone in their home, surrounded by the quiet ticking of the clock on the wall, amplifying his growing rage and sense of betrayal. When Maya finally returned home that evening, she was met with the sight of David sitting on the edge of their bed, the documents spread out before him like evidence of a crime. The moment her eyes fell on the papers, her face drained of color. She froze in the doorway, her hand tightening around the doorknob as if she were preparing to escape. "You lied to me." David's voice was barely a whisper, trembling with rage. He stood slowly, holding the papers aloft like a trophy of betrayal. "Who are you?" Maya's heart sank as the reality of the situation crashed down upon her. She had always known this day might come, the day when her past would catch up with her, but she never imagined it would happen like this. "David, please. I was going to tell you. I swear I was, but I didn't know how. I love you. This doesn't change who I am or who we are," she pleaded, stepping cautiously toward him, tears welling in her eyes. Yet her words only fueled the fire within David. "It doesn't change who you are? You've been lying to me this whole time." His voice grew louder, more frantic, as if he were struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the betrayal. "You tricked me into marrying you. Do you know what you've done? I gave you everything. My love, my loyalty, my life. And this whole time you've been lying to me about the most basic thing." Maya's tears streamed down her face as she desperately tried to explain herself. "I didn't tell you because I was afraid of losing you. You mean everything to me. I thought if you knew, you wouldn't love me anymore." David's face twisted in fury. "You thought right," he spat, his anger spiraling out of control, a whirlwind of emotions that he could no longer contain. The room felt like it was closing in on him, the once beloved wife now transformed into a complete stranger in his eyes. The argument escalated, each passing moment intensifying the conflict. Maya stood helpless, trapped between her desire to explain herself and the fear of what David might do next. She had never seen him like this, so out of control, so full of rage. "David, please just calm down. We can talk about this. I'll answer any questions you have. Just please don't do anything rash." But David was no longer listening. All he could see was red, the betrayal burning through him like an uncontrollable fire. In a blind moment of rage, he stormed into the garage, his eyes landing on a hammer. Without hesitation, he grabbed it, returning to the house with chilling determination. Maya stood frozen in the bedroom, her heart pounding in her chest as she saw the hammer in David's hand. In a burst of uncontrollable fury, David swung the hammer down with brutal force. Maya screamed, trying to shield herself from the impending attack, but David was relentless. Blow after blow, he struck her with terrifying violence, her cries for mercy drowned out by the sound of the hammer hitting flesh. The walls of their home quickly became splattered with blood, the brutality of the assault escalating beyond comprehension. As the horror unfolded, David's mind spiraled deeper into madness. He dragged Maya's lifeless body into the bathroom, his grip on reality slipping away as he grabbed a knife from the kitchen drawer. The rage had completely consumed him, any sense of humanity erased as he began to mutilate her body, slashing and cutting with reckless abandon. By the time the authorities arrived, Maya's body was barely recognizable, her face and form marred by David's unhinged brutality. Blood soaked the walls and floor, and in the middle of the room sat David, covered in blood, staring blankly at the devastation he had unleashed. His expression was one of haunting disbelief, as if he couldn't fully comprehend the horror he had just created. In a daze, David grabbed his phone, hands trembling as he dialed for help. I killed her," he whispered to the operator, his voice hollow and devoid of emotion. The operator tried to keep him on the line, asking for details, but David could hardly form coherent thoughts. All he knew was that his life had spiraled into a dark abyss from which there was no return. When the police arrived, they found David sitting on the floor beside Maya's lifeless, mutilated body, his face stained with tears, his hands still covered in her blood. The man who had once been a proud, hard-working husband was now reduced to a broken shell, consumed by the weight of his actions. The news of Maya's death sent shockwaves through their tight-knit Houston community as the media picked up the story, revealing the gruesome details of her murder and the secret that had led to such violence. As the story unfolded, it sparked a nationwide debate. Some painted David as a man who had been betrayed, while others condemned his actions as nothing short of monstrous. The media frenzy only intensified the scrutiny on both David and Maya. What had started as a secret kept out of fear had ended in an unimaginable tragedy. The detectives who responded to the scene were seasoned professionals, but nothing could prepare them for the horror they encountered that day. Maya's mutilated body lay in a pool of blood, the once pristine walls of the home transformed into a grotesque canvas of violence. The house, which had once symbolized love and a hopeful future, was now forever stained by death and betrayal. At the police station, David found himself sitting in an interrogation room, his blood-stained clothes replaced by a simple white jumpsuit. Yet no matter how much he was cleaned up, the horror of that day lingered on his skin, a constant reminder of what he had done. Hours passed as detectives tried to piece together the events that had led to such unimaginable brutality. "Why did you do it, David?" one detective asked, his voice steady but probing. He sought to find a crack in the wall of silence that David had built around himself. For the first time since his arrest, David looked up, his eyes hollow and haunted, filled with a mixture of sorrow and disbelief. "I didn't know," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "I loved her, and she lied to me. She wasn't who she said she was." The detective leaned forward, his tone becoming more insistent. "So you decided to beat her to death and then mutilate her? Do you realize what you've done?" David's gaze dropped again, and he remained silent, as if the weight of his actions was too much to bear. It became clear that something had snapped within him, a fragile mind pushed to the breaking point by a combination of betrayal, rage, and deep-seated insecurities. The brutal crime made headlines across the nation, not only because of its shocking violence, but also due to the controversy surrounding Maya's past. The revelation that she had been a transgender woman sent shockwaves through the media, igniting debates on gender identity, secrecy, and the limits of trust in relationships. As the trial date approached, David's legal team prepared a defense centered on emotional distress, attempting to portray him as a man who had been so deeply betrayed that he lost control in a moment of madness. They argued that David had been pushed to the brink by the shock of discovering Maya's secret and the emotional toll it took on him. On the other hand, the prosecution painted a very different picture. They presented David as a cold-blooded killer who had brutally murdered his wife in a savage rage. Maya's character came under scrutiny, her private life becoming fodder for the tabloids. Yet the focus remained on David, whose actions that fateful day would be dissected and analyzed in court. Witnesses were called to testify, friends and neighbors describing David and Maya as a happy couple. However, some noted that David had always seemed a bit controlling, a hint of darkness lurking beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life. As the trial progressed, the courtroom became a theater of emotion, with graphic photos of the crime scene presented to the jury. The images of blood-splattered walls and Maya's mutilated body left the jury in shocked silence. One of the most gut-wrenching moments came when Maya's mother took the stand. Her face etched with grief, she recounted how much her daughter had loved David and how she had always worried about revealing the truth to him. Her words hung in the courtroom like a heavy cloud, a poignant reminder of a life cut short. After weeks of testimony, closing arguments, and emotional pleas from both sides, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. David showed little reaction as the sentence was read, his face a blank mask of resignation. He had gone from a newlywed husband with a promising future to a convicted murderer. As he was led from the courtroom, David glanced up at the gallery where Maya's family sat, their eyes filled with pain and loss. It was clear that no amount of justice could ever bring her back or undo the damage that had been done. Even after the trial, the case continued to stir debates online, racking up millions of views as documentaries and clips circulated. The story of Maya's life and tragic death resonated with many, igniting discussions around the treatment of transgender individuals and the violence they often face. Supporters of Maya created a viral hashtag, Justice for Maya, calling for greater protection and rights for transgender people. The house where Maya had been murdered eventually went up for sale, but neighbors noted that it never felt the same. The horrific events had left a permanent scar on the community, one that would take years to heal. People whispered about the tragedy in hushed tones, the memory of that fateful night lingering in the air like a dark cloud. Meanwhile, David's family struggled to come to terms with the horrifying crime. Some members expressed disbelief, claiming they never truly knew the man capable of such violence. The case not only shattered the lives of those directly involved, but also sent ripples through the community, forcing everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about identity, trust, and the fragility of human relationships. This story is not just about murder. It serves as a powerful reminder of how deep-seated fears and societal pressures can tear lives apart in the most brutal of ways. David's uncontrollable rage stands as a chilling reminder of the dangers that arise when identity, trust, and masculinity collide tragically. In the end, the tragedy of David and Maya serves as a poignant lesson about the importance of honesty, acceptance, and the dire consequences that can arise when those principles are neglected. We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments section below. And if you found this story insightful, please subscribe and leave us a like. We would really appreciate that. It was a quiet afternoon in Bel Air, Ohio on May 7, 2017. The small, blue-collar town sat on the banks of the Ohio River, a place where neighbors knew one another and crime was rare. But that evening, a horrifying discovery would shatter that sense of safety. Stay with me as we unravel the real truth. Welcome to Fatal Affairs, a channel solely focused on bringing daily told and untold crime cases on love, betrayal, and revenge. Thanks to all our viewers and subscribers for your unwavering support, and please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for future updates. We would really appreciate that. David Kinney, a 31-year-old married man, arrived at his friend Brad McGarry's house. But he wasn't alone. He had brought his wife and stepdaughter along. When they stepped inside, they were met with a grisly scene. Lying face down in the basement was Brad McGarry, his body still, blood pooling beneath his head. He had been executed, shot twice in the back of the head at close range. The brutality of the murder shocked even the responding officers, but the real mystery was yet to unfold. Brad McGarry was well known in the community. A friendly, hard-working man, he had lived openly as a gay man in a town that wasn't always accepting. He had his fair share of struggles, but was loved by those who truly knew him. And among those people was David Kinney, his best friend. Or so everyone believed. At first, Kinney appeared devastated. He clung to his wife, seemingly in shock. He told the police he had come to check on Brad after not hearing from him all day. But as detectives started piecing together the timeline, inconsistencies in Kinney's story began to surface. His alibi was shaky, his emotions seemed forced, and there was something about his presence at the crime scene that just didn't sit right. The crime scene itself told its own story. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, nothing that indicated a robbery gone wrong. Brad had known his killer. He had trusted them enough to turn his back on them, unaware that death was just inches away. The police immediately began questioning those closest to Brad. Friends described him as generous and kind, but they also mentioned his longing for love. He had struggled with relationships in the past, often falling for the wrong people. He had confided in some that he was seeing someone new, but he had kept the details private. It was a secret relationship, one that no one knew much about, and that secret would soon become the center of the investigation. As investigators dug deeper, a name kept surfacing in Brad's phone records and messages: David Kinney. They had been in frequent contact, more than just two casual friends. Detectives began to wonder, could this best friend be more than just a grieving acquaintance? Was there something between them that no one else knew about? The breaking point came when the police reviewed Brad's social media. Hidden in his messages was an intimate exchange between him and Kinney. The texts revealed a relationship that went far beyond friendship. But there was one problem. Kinney was married to a woman. He had built his life around the image of a family man, yet he was hiding a part of himself. The discovery changed everything. The police now had a motive: fear and exposure. Kinney had everything to lose if his secret relationship with Brad came to light. A possible affair, a double life. Could these be the driving forces behind the murder? Investigators knew they needed to confront Kinney directly. They called him in for questioning, and what followed was one of the most bizarre and revealing interrogations they had ever conducted. At first, he maintained his innocence, claiming he had no idea who would hurt Brad. But as detectives pushed him with evidence, his story began to shift. First, he said he had last seen Brad days ago. Then, he admitted he had been there the same day but left before anything happened. Finally, he confessed that they had an argument. But Kinney's confessions were layered in half-truths. Detectives could see he was unraveling, struggling to keep up with his own lies. And then, in a moment of desperation, he changed his story again. This time, claiming he had been present when Brad was murdered, but that someone else had pulled the trigger. It was a last-ditch effort to deflect blame, but the investigators weren't buying it. By the end of the first interrogation, Kinney had implicated himself multiple times. His timeline was falling apart, and the evidence against him was growing stronger by the hour. As police prepared their next steps, they knew one thing for sure. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was personal, and they were getting closer to proving that David Kinney had something to hide, something deadly. As the investigation into Brad McGarry's murder continued, the pressure on David Kinney began to mount. The crime scene had told its own silent story. There was no forced entry, no signs of struggle, and nothing had been stolen. Whoever had killed Brad had done so with precision and intent, execution style, and the evidence was beginning to point in only one direction. The interrogation room was cold, the fluorescent lights humming softly above as Kinney sat across from detectives. He maintained his innocence, at least at first. His initial statement was simple. He had gone to Brad's house that evening with his wife and stepdaughter, only to find his best friend murdered. But as detectives pushed harder, the cracks in his alibi widened. One of the first major inconsistencies was Kinney's timeline. He had told police he hadn't seen Brad that day, but phone records proved otherwise. Surveillance footage from a gas station near Brad's house also showed Kinney's truck driving through the area at a time that directly contradicted his claims. "Why did you tell us you hadn't seen him?" one detective asked, leaning in, his eyes locked onto Kinney's. I guess I forgot," Kinney stammered, his fingers twitching slightly on the table. But the investigators weren't buying it. They had already retrieved more damning evidence: Brad's text messages. In those messages, Brad had been expecting Kinney that day. They had made plans to meet up, just like they had done many times before. But now Brad was dead, and Kinney was the last known person to have seen him alive. The detectives let the silence stretch, letting Kinney stew in his own lies before one of them spoke again. "You told us you didn't see Brad that day, but your phone shows you texted him just before you got to his house, and the security footage doesn't lie." Kinney swallowed hard, his gaze shifting to the table. Okay, maybe I did see him," he admitted. "But I swear, when I left, he was fine." Detectives weren't satisfied. They pressed further. Kinney's story was changing, but he was still leaving something out, something big. As police continued their investigation, they uncovered something unexpected. Kinney and McGarry's relationship wasn't just a casual friendship, it was something much deeper. Friends of Brad had already hinted that he had been involved in a secret romantic relationship, but they hadn't known with whom. Now detectives had their answer. Phone records, text messages, and private conversations painted a picture of a hidden relationship between the two men, one that Kinney had desperately tried to keep secret. Kinney was married. He had built a life as a devoted husband and stepfather, living what seemed like a conventional family life. But his relationship with Brad threatened to unravel everything. If the truth came out, his world would come crashing down. And perhaps Brad had started to realize that. One of Brad's friends would later tell investigators that Brad had been frustrated. He wanted Kinney to acknowledge their relationship, but Kinney refused. Was it possible that an argument over this had led to murder? With this new information, detectives had a motive: fear. Fear of exposure, fear of losing his marriage, fear of his secret life being revealed. If Brad had threatened to tell Kinney's wife or anyone else about their relationship, Kinney would have had everything to lose. With this new evidence in hand, detectives brought Kinney back for further questioning. This time, they confronted him with what they knew. "We know about you and Brad," one detective said bluntly, sliding a stack of text message transcripts across the table. Kinney's face drained of color. "I don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, avoiding their gaze. "Come on, David. We have the messages. We have witnesses. We know what was going on between you two." For the first time, Kinney looked genuinely panicked. He had worked so hard to keep his life compartmentalized, and now, piece by piece, it was falling apart. "You don't understand," he finally whispered. "I had no choice." Those 4 words sent a chill through the room. No choice? What did that mean? Detectives pressed further, but Kinney clammed up. It was clear he was hiding something, but now it was no longer a question of if he was involved, it was a question of how. As they continued to corner him, Kinney's story began to unravel completely, and soon they would get the truth, a truth darker than anyone could have imagined. David Kinney sat across from the detectives, his hands clasped tightly together, his knuckles white from the pressure. The room was silent, except for the hum of the overhead lights. He had dodged and deflected their questions for hours, but now, with mounting evidence against him, he was running out of ways to explain himself. "David," one detective began, his voice calm but firm, "we know you were with Brad the day he was killed. We know about your relationship. What we don't know is why. Why did this happen?" Kinney's face was a mixture of exhaustion and panic. He took a deep breath, his gaze flickering between the 2 detectives, searching for an escape, but there was none. "I didn't do it," he muttered. But his voice lacked conviction. He was crumbling. The lies start to unravel. At this point in the interrogation, detectives had already caught Kinney in multiple lies. His timeline was inconsistent. His claims of last seeing Brad days before the murder had been disproven by phone records and surveillance footage. But the biggest crack came when investigators presented him with the messages between him and Brad. "You told us you weren't in contact with Brad that day," one detective said, sliding the printed text messages across the table. "Then why does he text you just hours before he was killed? Why did you say you were coming over?" Kinney's breathing grew uneven. He licked his lips, his mind racing for another way out, another excuse, but there were none left. I was there, okay?" he finally admitted. "I was at his house, but I didn't kill him." A shaky confession. The detectives leaned in. This was the break they had been waiting for. "Tell us what happened, David," one of them urged. "Tell us the truth." Kinney exhaled sharply. "We got into an argument," he admitted. "Brad wanted more. He was pressuring me. He wanted to tell people about us." "And you didn't want that," a detective interjected. Kinney shook his head violently. "No, I couldn't. My wife, my family, everything would have been ruined." "So you killed him?" "No," Kinney insisted. "I mean, I left. I stormed out. But when I left, he was alive." The detectives exchanged a glance. They had heard this kind of half-confession before, one that acknowledged guilt but avoided responsibility. "Then who killed him, David?" one detective asked. Kinney hesitated. He had no answer. The walls were closing in. While detectives continued pressing Kinney, forensic investigators were busy analyzing the crime scene. The gunshot wounds to Brad's head were executed with precision. 2 shots, close range. This wasn't a struggle. It was an execution. And then the most damning evidence surfaced. Kinney's fingerprints on shell casings found at the scene. When detectives confronted him with this evidence, Kinney's demeanor shifted. He lowered his head, his fingers gripping his knees. "That's not possible," he mumbled. "That's not possible." "But it is," the detective said. "You were there, and you pulled the trigger. Weren't you, David?" Kinney didn't respond. Silence filled the room, the weight of his own actions pressing down on him like an anchor. As the hours dragged on, Kinney's story shifted again. He started to admit things he hadn't before. "Yes, we fought. Yes, I was angry. Yes, I grabbed my gun." He paused. "But I swear, I didn't mean to." The detectives sat back, their work nearly complete. They had their confession, but there was still more to uncover. Why had Kinney truly killed Brad? Was it fear? Was it anger? Or was it something even darker? And most importantly, would he ever admit the full truth? The weight of his lies had become unbearable. After hours of interrogation, David Kinney was crumbling, his defenses shattering under the relentless pressure of the detectives. The room was silent, except for the low hum of the overhead fluorescent light. He had spent hours denying, twisting, and altering his version of events, but the truth had been closing in on him from the moment he set foot in that room. Kinney sat back in his chair, staring at the floor. The detectives remained motionless, giving him space to process the inevitable. Finally, Kinney exhaled, a long, shaky breath before he spoke again. "I didn't mean for it to happen like that," he muttered. One of the detectives leaned in, his voice calm but firm. "Then tell us what happened, David. Tell us everything." Kinney wiped his hands over his face, struggling to find the words. Brad and I, we were close, closer than anyone knew. We had been seeing each other for a while, but he wanted more. He was tired of being a secret. He wanted me to leave my wife. The detectives exchanged glances. This was the final piece of the puzzle. Kinney continued, his voice thick with emotion. We argued about it for weeks. Every time I saw him, it was the same thing. He said he was tired of hiding. He threatened to tell my wife himself if I wouldn't do it. He said he loved me, but he couldn't live like this anymore. Kinney shook his head, his eyes unfocused, lost in the memory. I begged him not to. I told him it would ruin everything. My marriage, my family, my entire life would be destroyed. He didn't care. He just kept pushing. The detective's voice remained steady. So what happened that day, David? Kinney's hands clenched into fists. I went to his house that day to talk. I thought I could make him understand. I thought if I reasoned with him, he'd change his mind. He said it was over, that if I wasn't willing to be with him openly, he was done hiding. And then he told me he had already made up his mind, that my wife was going to find out one way or another. Kinney's voice trembled now. I panicked. I begged him to reconsider, but he wouldn't listen. He told me I was a coward, that I never really loved him, that I was only using him, and then he turned his back on me. The room fell into silence. And that's when you shot him, the detective finished. Kinney's face twisted in anguish. I didn't mean to. I swear I didn't. I snapped. 1 second I was standing there, and the next I had the gun in my hand. I don't even remember pulling the trigger. But then he was on the ground, and there was blood everywhere. You shot him twice, David, the detective reminded him. Once wasn't enough. Kinney let out a choked sob. The first shot, he fell, but he was still alive. He was looking up at me. I don't know if he was trying to say something or if he was just staring, but I couldn't stand it. I couldn't stand seeing him like that, so I pulled the trigger again. And then what? The detective pressed. Kinney's breathing was ragged. I panicked. I had never felt fear like that before. I just stood there staring at his body. Then I realized what I had done. I knew I had to do something, so I staged it like a robbery. I moved some things around. I left the back door open. I thought maybe it would look like someone else did it. The detective nodded. But you didn't take anything. There was no forced entry. It was too clean. That's why we knew it wasn't a random crime. Kinney rubbed his face, his body trembling. I didn't know what else to do. I left. I drove around for hours, trying to think. I went home, acted normal, like nothing happened. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. And then when I found out the police were investigating, I knew it was only a matter of time. The detective leaned back, taking a deep breath. So you went to the house with your wife and stepdaughter, pretending to find the body, trying to make it look like you were just as shocked as everyone else? Kinney nodded. I had to. I thought if I acted like I had just found him, no one would suspect me. But it didn't work. Did it? He let out a dry, humorless chuckle. You knew the whole time. We knew something wasn't right, the detective admitted. But now we know the whole truth. Kinney buried his face in his hands. I didn't want to kill him. I loved him. I was scared. I was so scared. The detective stood. Fear or not, David, Brad is dead, and now you have to face the consequences. The confession had sealed David Kinney's fate. His words were recorded, his guilt undeniable, and now the long road to justice had begun. The courtroom was packed with reporters, family members, and those who had followed the tragic case from the moment Brad McGarry's body was discovered. The air inside was heavy, charged with anticipation and sorrow. As Kinney was led into the courtroom in his orange jumpsuit, shackled at the wrists and ankles, he kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone. He had once been a family man, a trusted friend, but now he was just another accused killer standing trial for a crime of passion. The prosecution wasted no time laying out their case. Their goal was clear, to prove that David Kinney had murdered Brad McGarry in cold blood, driven by fear, desperation, and the desire to keep his double life a secret. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the prosecutor began, pacing the floor with confident steps. This is a case of deception, betrayal, and ultimately murder. The defendant, David Kinney, lived 2 lives, one as a devoted husband and father, the other as a secret lover to the victim, Brad McGarry. When that secret was threatened, he didn't choose honesty. He didn't choose integrity. He chose murder. The jury sat motionless, eyes locked on the prosecutor, absorbing every word. "We have his confession. We have the murder weapon. We have his fingerprints on the shell casings. But even before that, we had something else, the truth. And the truth has only one conclusion. David Kinney is guilty of murder." Kinney's defense attorney shifted uncomfortably. This was going to be an uphill battle. When the defense attorney stood to give his opening statement, his approach was cautious but firm. His goal was not to deny that Kinney had killed Brad McGarry. There was no escaping that fact. Instead, he aimed to paint Kinney as a man who had acted out of fear and emotional turmoil rather than cold-blooded intent. "This case is not as simple as the prosecution would have you believe," he said. "Yes, my client pulled the trigger. Yes, he was there that day. But this was not a calculated act of murder. It was a tragic, emotional outburst, a moment of fear, of panic, of desperation." He turned to the jury, his voice softer now. "David Kinney is not a monster. He is a man who made a terrible mistake. We ask you to consider not just what happened, but why it happened." The prosecution scoffed at this angle. To them, it was nothing more than an attempt to downplay premeditated murder. The trial moved swiftly as the prosecution brought forth witnesses to further solidify their case. Brad McGarry's friends testified about his growing frustration with being kept a secret, about the tension between him and Kinney in the weeks leading up to his death. "Brad wasn't the type to keep quiet forever," one friend testified. "He was tired of being hidden. He told me, one way or another, David's going to have to choose." The prosecution seized on that statement. "And what happened just days later?" the prosecutor asked. The friend's voice wavered. "Brad was dead." Next came the forensic experts, detailing the trajectory of the bullets, the lack of defensive wounds, the placement of the body. Everything pointed to an execution-style killing, not a crime of passion. Then, the most damning witness of all took the stand, Kinney's own wife. She sat stiffly in the witness chair, her eyes red from exhaustion and grief. The betrayal was still fresh, the humiliation still raw. "Did you know your husband was having a relationship with Brad McGarry?" the prosecutor asked gently. She shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, I had no idea." "And when you arrived at Brad McGarry's home with your husband, what did you see?" She swallowed hard. "David, he acted so shocked. He kept saying, 'Who would do this?' But now I know. Now I know he was lying the whole time." Her voice cracked, and she covered her mouth, sobbing quietly. The courtroom was silent, the weight of her words suffocating. The jury watched her closely. If there had been any doubt left, it was fading fast. In a risky move, Kinney's defense attorney called him to testify. It was his last chance to salvage some shred of sympathy from the jury. Dressed in a suit, Kinney sat on the witness stand, hands folded in his lap. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed his fear. "I never wanted to hurt Brad," he said. "I loved him. I was afraid. Afraid of what would happen if anyone found out." The prosecutor wasted no time. "Afraid of losing your family, or afraid of being exposed?" Kinney hesitated. "Both." The prosecutor leaned in. "Mr. Kinney, you shot Brad McGarry twice. The first shot incapacitated him. He was still alive. You had a chance to stop. Why did you shoot him again?" Kinney's face crumbled. He had no answer. The prosecutor turned to the jury. "Because it wasn't an accident. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was murder." The jury remained stoic, but the conclusion was becoming clearer by the second. As the trial neared its end, both sides made their final pleas to the jury. The prosecution urged them to see Kinney for what he was, a man who chose his own secrets over another person's life. The defense, on the other hand, asked them to see him as a flawed man who made a devastating mistake. When the jury left to deliberate, the courtroom remained tense, filled with whispered conversations and anxious glances. The weight of the trial, the emotions, the betrayal, it all hung in the air. David Kinney sat motionless, staring at the table before him. His fate was now in the hands of 12 strangers. The only question that remained was, would they see him as a desperate man who lost control, or as a murderer who had coldly silenced his secret lover? The jury's deliberation was long and intense. The court had emptied out for the evening, leaving only the remnants of the trial's emotional charge. David Kinney sat alone in the courtroom, his eyes unfocused, his mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. His defense had tried to paint him as a man overwhelmed by fear, but the prosecution's case had been unyielding. The question that had haunted him since the night of Brad McGarry's death still lingered in the air. Had he killed because of love, or because of a twisted fear of exposure. Outside the courtroom, reporters huddled together, speculating on the outcome. Some believed Kinney's defense would resonate with the jury, but others thought the weight of the evidence, the confession, the testimonies, the cold-blooded nature of the second shot would be too much to ignore. The jury returned to the courtroom on the fifth day of deliberation. The tension was palpable as the foreman stood to address the court. David's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the jury, unable to gauge their emotions. The moment of truth had arrived. The foreman's voice rang out, clear and solemn. "We, the jury, find the defendant, David Kinney, guilty of first-degree murder." The room erupted into a stunned silence. Kinney's face remained expressionless, though his hands trembled slightly. He had expected the verdict, but hearing it spoken aloud was a jarring reality. His defense attorney placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, but there was no escaping the weight of his guilt. We invite you to share your thoughts. The prosecution stood with quiet triumph, and if you found this story insightful, sealed, please subscribe. David Kinney was led away in handcuffs. His future really appreciate that. The family of Brad McGarry sat in the front row, some wiping away tears, others with stone-cold expressions. They had finally seen justice for their son, brother, and friend. The sentencing came weeks later, and David Kinney faced the judge with his head bowed, his fate now sealed. He had been convicted of first-degree murder, and the only remaining question was how long he would spend behind bars. The judge was unflinching as she addressed Kinney. "David Kinney, you took the life of a man who trusted you. You betrayed that trust, and in doing so, you destroyed not only the life of Brad McGarry, but also the lives of your own family. Your actions were driven by fear and deceit, but they were also premeditated. You shot Brad McGarry, and you took the opportunity to end his life, even after he was incapacitated." She paused, her eyes briefly flicking to the McGarry family in the front row. "For your crime, I hereby sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole." A wave of relief swept over Brad's family, but it was a bittersweet victory. No sentence, no matter how harsh, could bring Brad back. They had waited years for this moment, but the grief of his loss would never be fully erased. The case of David Kinney and Brad McGarry had sent shockwaves through the community. It had been a story of hidden lives, deceit, and murder. For those who had known David as a husband, father, and friend, the revelation of his double life was a betrayal beyond measure. Many struggled to reconcile the man they had once admired with the man who had killed in cold blood. But for others, the case represented the destructive power of secrets, how the fear of being exposed could drive someone to do unspeakable things. The tragedy had left scars on all who had been involved, and it had served as a painful reminder of the consequences of living a life built on lies. David Kinney's family, too, had been torn apart by the events. His wife, though devastated by the revelation of his affair and the murder, had tried to rebuild her life, but the stain of her husband's actions would linger forever. She was left to pick up the pieces of a shattered family, all while grappling with the loss of the man she had once trusted. Brad McGarry, though gone, would not be forgotten. His story would be told, over and over again, as a reminder of the dangers of secrecy and the tragic consequences of betrayal. For those who had known him, Brad's memory lived on, not just as the victim of a murder, but as someone who had been loved and cherished, a man who had been caught in a web of deceit he had never deserved to be part of. In the years that followed, the case continued to haunt the community, lingering in conversations, in the quiet moments when people reflected on the choices that had been made. The murder of Brad McGarry was a tragedy, one that could have been avoided if only honesty and transparency had been embraced. But in the end, the truth had been revealed and justice had been served. As for David Kinney, his life was now confined to the prison walls he would never escape. The man who had once been a family man, a husband, and a friend was now nothing more than a shadow of the person he had once been. His guilt had been laid bare for all to see, and in the quiet darkness of his cell, he would have to confront the reality of his actions for the rest of his life. And so, the story of David Kinney and Brad McGarry came to its inevitable conclusion, a tale of love, betrayal, and the ultimate cost of secrets. It would be remembered as a cautionary tale, a reminder of how one man's fear and deception could lead to the irreversible loss of another life. We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments section below. And if you found this story insightful, Please subscribe and leave us a like. We would really appreciate that. In the heart of the Motor City, a tragedy was unfolding, one that would unveil the dark underbelly of secrets, prejudice, and violence. The life of a young transgender woman named Clara Mitchell was snuffed out on a frigid December morning. Her murder would not only serve as a grim reminder of the dangers faced by those who dare to live authentically, but would also set off an investigation that would lead to an unexpected suspect, a man of the cloth, Pastor Samuel Hayes. Pastor Hayes was a prominent figure in the community, known for his impassioned sermons and charitable endeavors. He was seen as a beacon of hope, a pillar of faith in a city often shrouded in darkness. Yet beneath this facade of piety and righteousness lay a hidden life, a life that, if exposed, would shatter the illusions surrounding him and force the city to confront its own demons. Clara, born Curtis Mitchell, had always felt different. From a tender age, she understood deep within her heart that she was a girl trapped in a boy's body. Growing up in Detroit was not easy. She faced ridicule, rejection, and even violence for daring to embrace her true self. Yet Clara was a fighter, refusing to let the hatred she encountered extinguish her vibrant spirit. She dreamed of a better life, a life where she could finally emerge as Clara, free from the chains of societal expectations. To survive, Clara turned to sex work, a perilous profession that put her at risk every night. However, it was a means to an end, a way to save every penny in hopes of one day affording the surgeries that would allow her to fully transition. She yearned for a world where she could walk down the street unafraid, where love and acceptance would no longer be distant dreams. But that dream was brutally shattered on that cold December morning. Clara's life, full of promise and pain, was stolen from her, and the investigation into her murder would reveal a shocking truth, one that would lead detectives down a twisted path of deceit. As the police began their investigation, Officer James Carter, a seasoned veteran with weary eyes, was wrapping up his shift. His thoughts were already on a hot cup of coffee in the warmth of his bed when something caught his eye. A figure lay sprawled on the sidewalk near a dimly lit alley, an area notorious for its late-night activities. With a pounding heart, Officer Carter approached the scene, his flashlight illuminating a gruesome sight. There lay Clara, motionless on the cold concrete. Her eyes were closed, her face pale and still. A dark stain bloomed on her chest, spreading ominously. Officer Carter knelt beside her, checking for a pulse, but it was no use. Clara was gone. The victim was later identified as Clara Mitchell, a 26-year-old transgender woman whose life had been tragically cut short. But Clara's death was different. It would expose deep-seated secrets and a web of violence that would send shockwaves far beyond the streets of Detroit. As the investigation into Clara Mitchell's death commenced, the detectives quickly uncovered evidence that would lead them to Pastor Samuel Hayes. Security footage from a nearby motel showed Clara entering a room with a man just hours before her body was discovered. That man, identified as Pastor Hayes, sent shockwaves through the community. How could a man of God, revered for his powerful sermons and commitment to his faith, be involved in such a heinous crime? The evidence began to mount. Detectives discovered that Hayes had been leading a double life, one hidden behind a facade of righteousness. He frequented online chat rooms and dating apps, often seeking encounters with transgender women. While he preached morality and virtue from the pulpit, he indulged in his hidden desires under the cover of night. Investigators learned that Hayes had met Clara online, exchanging intimate messages for weeks. On the night of her murder, he had arranged to meet her at the motel. What began as a consensual encounter took a dark turn, the details of which remained murky, shrouded in the secrecy of that motel room. One thing became clear: something had gone terribly wrong. Perhaps overwhelmed by guilt, shame, or fear, Hayes turned to violence, taking Clara's life and silencing her forever. The arrest of Pastor Hayes sent ripples of shock through the community. His congregation was devastated, struggling to reconcile their beloved pastor's actions with the man they had admired. The case quickly spiraled into a media sensation, with news outlets across the country reporting on the fall of the pastor and the tragic death of Clara Mitchell. Yet, amidst the sensationalism, Clara's story was often lost. She was more than just a victim. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend with dreams, hopes, and aspirations. Clara deserved to live a life free from violence and discrimination. The news of Clara's death hit her family like a tidal wave. Her mother, Margaret, collapsed upon hearing the news, her cries echoing through their small apartment. Clara's siblings, still reeling from the shock, struggled to understand the brutal reality of their sister's murder. Despite the hardships she faced, Clara had always been a source of joy and laughter in their lives. She was the life of the party, a beacon of light in her family. And now, that light was extinguished. Margaret would often sit by the window, staring out at the city streets, hoping to catch a glimpse of her daughter walking by, her laughter echoing in the air. But it was just a cruel trick of the mind, a phantom image that deepened her sorrow. Clara's siblings each grappled with the loss in different ways. Her older brother, Jacob, became withdrawn and angry, his grief manifesting as simmering rage. He couldn't comprehend why someone would harm his sister, or why the world could be so cruel. Meanwhile, her younger sister, Lily, found solace in memories, clinging to the happy times they had shared. The family gathered for Clara's funeral, a somber affair filled with tears and whispered condolences. Friends and members of the LGBTQ community came to pay their respects, sharing stories of Clara's kindness, resilience, and unwavering spirit. They spoke of her dreams, the future that had been cruelly snatched away. Margaret stood before her daughter's coffin, her voice choked with emotion, as she spoke of the pain of losing a child, the emptiness that would forever haunt her. As the funeral drew to a close, a sense of determination settled over Clara's family. They would not let her death be in vain. They would fight for justice, recognition, and a world where transgender individuals would no longer be targets of violence and hate. They vowed to honor Clara's memory by carrying her spirit of love and acceptance into the world, ensuring that her light would continue to shine brightly even in the darkest of times. The arrest of Pastor Samuel Hayes was merely the beginning of a tumultuous journey for Clara's family. While many were quick to condemn him, others rallied to his defense. His congregation, torn between their faith and the horrifying accusations, struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the crime he was accused of committing. Some whispered that Hayes was innocent, a victim of conspiracy, pointing to his years of service, dedication to the community, and unwavering faith. They argued that he was being targeted for his beliefs and lifestyle, while others saw him as a symbol of hypocrisy and violence. The trial of Samuel Hayes became a battleground for these conflicting narratives. The prosecution painted a picture of a man consumed by his desires, who used his position to prey on vulnerable individuals. They presented evidence of his online activity, secret encounters, and attempts to cover up his crime. In contrast, the defense argued that Hayes had been lured into a dangerous situation and acted in self-defense. They portrayed him as a man struggling with internal demons, a flawed individual who had made a terrible mistake but was ultimately not a murderer. The courtroom was packed with spectators, each holding their own opinions and biases. Clara's family sat in the front row, their faces etched with grief and anger as they listened to the testimony, arguments, and accusations, hearts heavy with the weight of their loss. As the trial progressed, whispers of doubt grew louder. Was Hayes a cold-blooded killer or a flawed man caught in a web of deceit? The jury faced the daunting task of deciding his fate, wrestling with these questions as the verdict hung in the balance. The courtroom fell silent as Samuel Hayes stood before the judge, dressed in a somber suit. The weight of the accusations hung heavy in the air, the eyes of the jury fixed upon him. After weeks of testimony, arguments, and deliberations, the moment of truth arrived. The jury foreman's voice trembled slightly as he read the verdict, guilty of second-degree murder and felony firearm possession. A collective gasp filled the courtroom as Clara's family wept silently, their faces a mixture of relief and sorrow. Hayes, his face pale and drawn, stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the floor. The judge, his voice grave and measured, sentenced Hayes to 25 years in prison, acknowledging the complexities of the case and the challenges faced by the jury. He spoke of the sanctity of life, the devastating consequences of violence, and the need for justice to be served. Given the opportunity to address the court, Hayes spoke in a low, halting voice. He expressed remorse for his actions, acknowledging the pain he had caused Clara's family and his own community. He spoke of his struggles, his internal conflicts, and the shame he had carried for so long. He pleaded for mercy, asking the court to consider his past service and potential for redemption. But his heartfelt words could not erase the tragedy that had unfolded. Clara Mitchell was gone, her life cut short by a senseless act of violence. As the trial concluded, the case of Samuel Hayes and Clara Mitchell served as a stark reminder of the complexities of human nature, of the dark secrets that lurk beneath the surface of even the most respected individuals. It highlighted the challenges faced by transgender individuals, the prejudice and discrimination that often lead to violence and tragedy, and underscored the importance of compassion, understanding, and acceptance in a world that can often be cruel and unforgiving. The verdict in the Samuel Hayes case sent ripples of unrest through Detroit. It was not merely a simple murder trial. It had become a symbol, a flashpoint in the ongoing struggle for equality and justice. The city found itself deeply divided, split along lines of faith, morality, and social justice. On one side stood those who believed Hayes was innocent, a victim of circumstance and prejudice. They viewed him as a good man who had made a mistake, one deserving of forgiveness and a second chance. Many in his congregation remained loyal, their faith in him unshaken. They organized prayer vigils, circulated petitions, and spoke out in his defense, arguing that he was being unfairly targeted. On the other side were those who saw Hayes as a symbol of hypocrisy and violence. They pointed to the undeniable evidence, the tragic loss of Clara's life, and the systemic discrimination faced by transgender individuals. They demanded accountability, not just for Hayes, but for a society that often turns a blind eye to violence against marginalized communities. Activists organized protests demanding justice for Clara and calling for an end to the hate and prejudice that fueled her death. The case became a lightning rod for debate, sparking heated discussions in homes, churches, and community centers across the city. Newspapers and television stations were flooded with letters and calls, opinions clashing, and voices raised in anger and frustration. In the midst of this turmoil, Clara's family struggled to find peace. They were grateful for the conviction, for the small measure of justice served, but they also understood that the sentence wouldn't bring Clara back. Their mourning continued, compounded by the ongoing public debate and the lingering divisions within the city. The case of Samuel Hayes and Clara Mitchell had become a mirror reflecting the complexities and contradictions of a society grappling with issues of identity, morality, and justice. It transcended the courtroom, resonating in the hearts and minds of Detroiters for years to come. Clara's story became a rallying cry for the LGBTQ+ community, highlighting the dangers faced by transgender individuals, particularly those involved in sex work. Activists seized the moment, demanding greater protection for transgender people and calling for an end to the discrimination and violence that plagued their community. The case forced a reckoning within the religious community as well. Hayes's hypocrisy, the double life he had led as a pastor and a closeted man seeking encounters with transgender women, shook the foundations of many congregations. In the wake of Clara's death and Hayes's conviction, conversations began to take place that had long been avoided. Some religious leaders called for greater understanding and acceptance of LGBTQ+ individuals, emphasizing the importance of love and compassion in the face of difference. Others, however, doubled down on their condemnation, clinging to traditional interpretations of Scripture and reinforcing harmful stereotypes. The case had a profound impact on Clara's family. While they were grateful for the conviction, they also understood that no amount of justice could bring Clara back. They channeled their grief into activism, becoming vocal advocates for transgender rights and working to ensure that Clara's story would not be forgotten. They established a foundation in her name, providing support and resources to transgender individuals in Detroit. They organized community events, raising awareness about the challenges faced by the transgender community and promoting understanding and acceptance. The ripple effects of Clara's death were felt throughout the city, sparking conversations that challenged assumptions and forced people to confront their biases. As the prison gates clanged shut behind Samuel Hayes, the sound echoed the finality of his sentence. No longer a pastor or a respected member of the community, he was just another face in the overcrowded prison system. Life behind bars became a harsh reality check for Hayes. Gone were the comforts of home, church, and family. He was surrounded by hardened criminals, men who had committed far worse crimes. He lived in a constant state of fear, always looking over his shoulder, wary of the violence that could erupt at any moment. Days turned into a monotonous routine of menial jobs in the prison laundry or kitchen, mandatory counseling sessions, and attempts to avoid trouble. Hayes had ample time to reflect on his actions, the choices that had led him to this dark place. He wrestled with guilt and shame, the weight of his sins pressing down on him. Prayer provided little solace. His faith felt shaken, his connection to God fractured. He received letters from his former congregation, some expressing forgiveness, others condemning him. Each letter was a reminder of the life he had taken and the pain he had caused. As the years passed, the prison walls, once cold and imposing, became a familiar backdrop to Hayes' life. The rage and confusion that had once consumed him slowly gave way to quiet introspection. He was no longer the man who had walked through those gates, blinded by secrets and desires. Prison life, with its harsh realities, stripped away the pretense he had carefully constructed. In unexpected places, he found solace. In the shared stories of other inmates, in quiet moments of contemplation, and in the simple act of helping others. He became a mentor to younger prisoners, sharing his story as a cautionary tale, urging them to choose a different path. Hayes discovered a talent for writing, pouring his thoughts and emotions into poems and essays. He wrote about his regrets, his longing for a second chance, and the lessons learned through facing his own darkness. His writings found their way outside prison walls, published in newsletters and online forums. He received letters from strangers touched by his words, who saw in his story a glimmer of hope, testament to the possibility of change. He even began corresponding with Clara's mother, Margaret. Their letters, initially filled with pain and anger, evolved into a fragile understanding, a shared grief that transcended boundaries of blame. Through these exchanges, Hayes learned about Clara's life, her dreams, her struggles, and her unwavering spirit. He came to see her not just as a victim, but as a woman who deserved love and respect. The day Samuel Hayes walked out of prison as a free man, the world felt both familiar and strange. The air smelled different, the sunlight seemed brighter. He was older now, his hair streaked with gray and his face etched with the weight of his past. Yet there was newfound clarity in his eyes, a sense of peace that had been absent for years. Returning to a city that had changed, Hayes found that Clara's name was etched in the collective memory, a symbol of the ongoing struggle for transgender rights. Her family had become tireless advocates, their voices echoing in the halls of power, demanding change and accountability. Though Hayes could never fully escape his past, the guilt and shame would always linger, a constant reminder of the life he had taken. Determined to use his experience to make a difference, he sought opportunities to share his story with community groups, churches, and even prisons. He spoke about the dangers of prejudice and hate, the importance of acceptance and understanding, and the transformative power of forgiveness. As he reconnected with his family, rebuilding strained relationships, he found solace in their love and support. He continued to write, his words reaching a wider audience, offering messages of hope and healing. Albert Hayes' legacy became a complex intertwining with Clara's tragic death, a legacy of hope, a testament to the possibility of change and redemption. This story serves as a stark reminder of the complexities of human nature and the enduring power of hope. It's a narrative about love and loss, prejudice and acceptance, and the struggle for justice alongside the possibility of redemption. Clara's life, though tragically cut short, became a catalyst for change, sparking conversations about the challenges faced by transgender individuals and the urgent need for equality and understanding. The story of Clara Mitchell and Samuel Hayes remains a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of forgiveness. It emphasizes the importance of building a world where everyone, regardless of gender identity or sexual orientation, can live free from fear and violence. We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments section below. And if you found this story insightful, please subscribe and leave us a like. We would really appreciate that. Love is frequently hailed as an unbreakable bond, a powerful force capable of overcoming any obstacle. But what occurs when that love is rooted in deception and hidden truths? In this narrative, a wedding ring, intended to signify the beginning of a shared life, transforms into a harrowing saga of treachery and violence. Set in a serene, affluent neighborhood, this tragic story unravels behind the facade of what was meant to be a flawless wedding, where happiness and excitement conceal the dark secrets poised to emerge. In the picturesque town of Maplewood, nestled between rolling hills and serene lakes, a palpable excitement filled the air. The sun cast golden rays on the charming streets, where white picket fences and blooming gardens painted a scene of idyllic suburban life. It was here that a wedding was set to take place, a union that promised to be a celebration of love and commitment. However, beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect day, dark currents of betrayal and unspoken truths were already beginning to swirl. The bride, Clara, stood in front of the mirror, her heart racing with anticipation. She was a vision of beauty in her elegant white gown, the delicate lace and satin hugging her figure in all the right places. Her long, flowing hair cascaded down her back, adorned with small pearls that glimmered like stars. Yet beneath her radiant smile lay an undercurrent of unease. Clara had always envisioned this day as the pinnacle of her happiness, a culmination of dreams and hopes. But in her heart, a nagging feeling whispered that something was amiss. Her fiancé Nathan was a devoted man, known for his kindness and unwavering loyalty. He had swept Clara off her feet with grand gestures and heartfelt promises. They had shared countless moments of laughter, joy, and intimacy, building a bond that seemed unbreakable. Yet as the wedding day drew near, Clara sensed a growing distance between them. Nathan's laughter no longer resonated with the same warmth, and his eyes, once so vibrant, appeared clouded with thoughts he dared not share. It was during these moments of introspection that Clara's mind often drifted to Marcus, Nathan's best friend. Marcus was charming and charismatic, with a quick wit that could light up a room. He had been a constant presence in Nathan's life, a confidant and ally. However, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper lying beneath the surface of their friendship, a connection that felt almost electric whenever they were all together. Their shared glances and subtle touches hinted at a bond that transcended mere friendship, but Clara pushed those thoughts aside, unwilling to entertain the notion of betrayal on what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. As the day unfolded, the wedding venue, a grand estate with manicured gardens and a sprawling ballroom, was abuzz with activity. Guests arrived, dressed in their finest attire, adorned with smiles and laughter that masked the tension brewing behind the scenes. Clara's family and friends flitted about, ensuring every detail was perfect, from the floral arrangements to the carefully curated playlist that would accompany their first dance. Yet amidst the joyful chaos, Clara felt a growing sense of dread tightening around her chest, a premonition of the storm that was about to break. In the shadows, Nathan and Marcus exchanged knowing glances, their camaraderie tinged with an unspoken tension. Nathan, standing at the altar, felt a whirlwind of emotions raging within him. He was at a crossroads, torn between the life he was about to commit to with Clara and the deep connection he shared with Marcus. Every moment spent with Marcus sparked a fire in his heart, a love so profound that it threatened to unravel the very fabric of his existence. As Clara took her place at the altar, her heart swelling with love for Nathan, she remained blissfully unaware of the turmoil that surrounded her. The vows exchanged that day were meant to symbolize a new beginning, a promise of eternal love and devotion. Yet the weight of hidden desires loomed large, casting a shadow over the ceremony that would soon unfold. The wedding ceremony commenced with an air of festivity, but beneath the surface, a tempest brewed. Clara walked down the aisle, her heart racing as she locked eyes with Nathan. He smiled, but the warmth of that smile felt distant, as though it was a mask concealing deeper fears. The guests rose in unison, their faces illuminated with joy, but Clara's gaze kept drifting to Marcus, who stood nearby as Nathan's best man. She noticed the way he shifted uncomfortably, a flicker of concern shadowing his features. As the officiant began to speak, Clara's mind wandered back to the moments leading up to this day. She remembered the excitement of their engagement, the romantic dinners, the laughter shared with friends. Yet memories of secretive conversations between Nathan and Marcus nagged at her thoughts. They had always been close, but lately there had been an intensity in their interactions that stirred an uncomfortable feeling in Clara's gut. Nathan recited his vows with a voice that wavered ever so slightly, betraying the internal conflict raging within him. Each word felt hollow, a script he had rehearsed countless times, but now felt foreign. He glanced at Marcus, whose expression mirrored the turmoil in his own heart. Their connection had deepened into something that transcended friendship, a secret that threatened to surface at any moment. The weight of their love hung heavily in the air, a silent acknowledgement of the choices they had made. As Clara placed her hand in Nathan's, she felt a rush of warmth, but it was quickly overshadowed by the unease that clung to her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that the joy of this day was somehow tainted. The ceremony continued, and as they exchanged rings, Clara felt a pang of doubt. The beautiful band that adorned her finger was meant to represent unity, but all she could think of was the hidden fracture that ran through their relationship. The reception that followed was filled with laughter and dancing, but Nathan's heart was heavy with guilt. Clara radiated happiness, her laughter echoing throughout the room, but Nathan felt like a ghost, drifting through the celebration with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Every time he looked at Clara, he was reminded of the life he had just committed to, a life that felt increasingly suffocating as he grappled with the truth he had yet to confront. In the shadows of the ballroom, Marcus observed the couple, his heart aching for the love they shared. He had always been there for Nathan, a source of strength and support, but now he felt like a bystander in a tragedy unfolding before his eyes. The connection he shared with Nathan was undeniable, yet he knew that their love was a secret that could shatter everything if revealed. The weight of their hidden relationship became a burden he could no longer bear. As the night wore on, Clara noticed the fleeting glances exchanged between Nathan and Marcus, a silent language that spoke volumes. She tried to brush off her growing suspicion, convincing herself that it was merely her imagination. But every time Nathan's gaze lingered on Marcus, her heart clenched with fear. The intimacy of their friendship felt like a barrier she could never penetrate, a world that existed just out of reach. The dance floor was alive with energy, but Nathan felt increasingly disconnected. He moved through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries and forced smiles. Clara twirled in her gown, lost in the euphoria of the moment, while Nathan's mind raced with thoughts of what lay ahead. He knew that the vows he had just exchanged would change everything, and the reality of his relationship with Marcus felt like a ticking time bomb. Amidst the revelry, the two men shared a brief moment alone, their eyes locking in a silent plea for understanding. Nathan's heart ached as he realized that he was standing at a precipice, teetering between two worlds, one filled with the love and commitment Clara represented, and the other ignited by the passion he felt for Marcus. The conflict was unbearable, and with every passing moment, the weight of his secret grew heavier. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere shifted from joyous celebration to an undercurrent of tension that no one could quite place. Clara, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing, continued to bask in the glow of her new marriage, but Nathan felt increasingly trapped in a web of lies. He watched as Clara danced with her friends, her laughter ringing like music in his ears, yet the sound felt hollow against the backdrop of his inner turmoil. Marcus, too, felt the weight of the evening pressing down on him. He had always cherished the bond he shared with Nathan, but tonight, that connection felt like a double-edged sword. Every smile he shared with Clara felt disingenuous, and every glance exchanged with Nathan was fraught with unspoken words. He longed to reach out, to bridge the growing chasm that separated them, but fear held him back. As the hour grew late and the guests began to disperse, Clara suggested they head to their bridal suite, eager to continue the celebration in private. Nathan's heart raced at the thought. The intimacy of their wedding night should have been a moment of pure joy, but instead it filled him with dread. He had just begun to confront the depth of his feelings for Marcus, and the thought of being alone with Clara felt insurmountable. Once inside the suite, Clara turned to Nathan, her eyes sparkling with love. She leaned in to kiss him, but Nathan found himself pulling away slightly, his heart pounding with guilt. Clara noticed the shift in his demeanor, her smile faltering as concern crept into her expression. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice laced with tenderness. "Yeah, just tired from the day," Nathan replied, forcing a smile that felt strained. Clara accepted his explanation, but doubt lingered in her eyes. She had always prided herself on being attuned to Nathan's feelings, and the tension between them felt like a heavy fog that refused to lift. Meanwhile, Marcus sat alone in his own room, wrestling with his emotions. The events of the day had unfolded like a whirlwind, and he found himself longing for Nathan, the man who had come to mean so much to him. Their friendship had blossomed into something beautiful yet terrifying, and the reality of their situation weighed heavily on his heart. He knew that the connection they shared could no longer remain a secret, yet the thought of revealing it felt like stepping into an abyss. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, Nathan felt a surge of desperation. He needed to talk to Marcus, to confront the feelings that had been simmering between them for so long. With each passing moment, the strength of his love for Marcus grew stronger, and he realized that pretending to be someone he was not was no longer an option. Unable to sleep, Nathan quietly slipped out of bed, careful not to disturb Clara. The hotel corridors were dimly lit, each step echoing in the silence as he made his way to Marcus's room. His heart raced with a mix of fear and anticipation. He needed to find clarity, to confront the truth that had been gnawing at him since the night of their first kiss. When Nathan finally knocked on Marcus's door, the wait felt agonizing. The door creaked open, revealing Marcus, whose expression mirrored the turmoil that plagued Nathan. "What are you doing here?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't stay away. We need to talk," Nathan replied, stepping inside as Marcus closed the door behind him. The air was thick with unspoken words, and both men knew that this conversation could change everything. They sat on the edge of the bed, the weight of their emotions palpable in the room. Nathan took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. "I can't keep pretending that everything is okay. I care about Clara, but what we have, it's real. I can't ignore it anymore." Marcus's gaze fell to the floor, his heart aching. "I feel the same way, but what do we do? You just married her, Nathan. We can't just throw everything away." "I don't want to hurt her," Nathan replied, his voice breaking. "But I can't deny my feelings for you. It's tearing me apart." At that moment, the tension between them reached a boiling point. In a moment of weakness, fueled by desperation and longing, they succumbed to the desire that had been simmering beneath the surface. They kissed, a fierce and passionate embrace that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. It was a release, a moment of clarity amidst the chaos of their emotions. As dawn approached, the air was thick with the aftermath of their encounter, a mixture of passion and guilt hanging heavily between them. Nathan pulled away, his heart racing as he faced the reality of what they had just done. The warmth of their connection was overshadowed by the chilling fear of the consequences that would inevitably follow. "I can't go back to Clara after this," Nathan whispered, the weight of his words sinking in. "What have we done?" Marcus looked at him, eyes filled with a mix of love and regret. "We can't pretend it didn't happen, but we have to think about Clara. She deserves the truth, even if it hurts." They sat in silence, the gravity of the situation pressing down on them. Nathan's mind raced with thoughts of Clara, her laughter, the vows they had exchanged. The love he felt for her was genuine, yet now it felt tainted by the truth he had hidden for far too long. Meanwhile, Clara lay awake in their bridal suite, a nagging feeling pulling at her heart. She turned to Nathan, who was still missing from her side, and panic set in. Where could he be at this hour? Her mind was filled with dark thoughts, and she felt a chill run down her spine. She slipped out of bed, pulling on a robe, and quietly left the room, her instincts guiding her toward Marcus's suite. As Clara approached Marcus's door, her heart raced. She hesitated, a knot forming in her stomach. The thought of barging in felt wrong, yet she needed to know the truth. Summoning her courage, she knocked softly, hoping to find Nathan safe and sound. When the door creaked open, Clara was met with a sight that shattered her world. Nathan stood inside, his face pale, and Marcus, still dressed in his underwear, looked equally as shocked. In that split second, the truth hit her like a freight train, and the ground beneath her feet felt as if it had crumbled away. "Clara!" Nathan exclaimed, his voice a mixture of surprise and dread. The atmosphere shifted from intimate to chaotic in an instant. Clara's mind raced, processing the betrayal that lay before her. "No, no, no, this can't be happening." Clara's voice trembled with disbelief, her heart pounding in her chest. The anger bubbled up inside her, fueled by betrayal and humiliation. She had trusted Nathan, and now it felt as if that trust had been shattered in a single moment. "Clara, let me explain," Nathan began, his voice pleading, but Clara couldn't bear to hear his words. The pain in her chest morphed into rage, and she lunged at him, the fury of her emotions blinding her. "You think you can explain this away? You've betrayed me in the worst way possible," Clara screamed, her voice echoing in the small room. Nathan stepped back, the weight of her accusation crashing down on him. Marcus stood frozen, torn between his love for Nathan and the guilt that consumed him. He had never imagined that their secret would lead to this moment, and now he felt helpless as Clara confronted Nathan with a fury he had never seen before. "Clara, please," Marcus finally managed to say, but his words fell flat against the tempest of emotions in the room. Clara's gaze shifted to him, and in that moment, she saw not just Nathan's best friend, but the man who had been complicit in the betrayal. "You," she spat, her voice laced with venom. "You were supposed to be my friend. How could you do this to me?" In the chaos of emotions, Clara's mind raced, and before she could fully comprehend what she was doing, she grabbed the nearest object, a heavy decorative lamp, and swung it with all her strength. The room fell into stunned silence as the lamp connected with Nathan's head, the impact sending him crashing to the floor. Time seemed to freeze as Clara stood there, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The reality of her actions began to sink in, but the rage still coursed through her veins. She watched in horror as Nathan lay motionless, blood pooling around him, the lifelessness of his eyes haunting her. "No!" Marcus shouted, rushing to Nathan's side, his hands trembling as he tried to stop the bleeding. But it was too late. The damage was done. Clara's world crumbled around her as the weight of her actions settled in. In her grief and madness, Clara turned on Marcus, consumed by a desperate need to place blame. "This is your fault," she screamed, her anger morphing into despair. The chaos of the moment spiraled out of control, and in a blind rage, she lashed out again. Marcus barely had time to react as Clara's fury swept over him. The second blow struck him down, leaving him beside Nathan, their blood mingling on the cold, unforgiving floor. The room descended into silence, a heavy, suffocating silence that echoed the finality of the tragedy that had just unfolded. As dawn broke, the first light of day filtered through the sheer curtains, casting a soft glow across the room. The aftermath of the chaotic night lay heavy in the air, a suffocating silence enveloping the space that had once been filled with joy and celebration. Clara knelt on the cold floor beside the bodies of her husband, Nathan, and his best friend, Marcus, the reality of her actions crashing down upon her like a tidal wave. The horror of what she had done seeped into her bones, and her heart raced with a mix of grief and disbelief. She shook Nathan gently, her hands trembling, hoping against hope that he would awaken, that somehow this nightmare could be undone. "Wake up, please," she cried, her voice breaking as desperation clawed at her throat. But there was no response, only the cold, lifeless gaze of the man she had vowed to love and cherish. The man she had unintentionally condemned with a single, reckless act of rage. A sense of panic surged through her as she turned to Marcus, who lay still, his face twisted in shock and fear. "What have I done?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, as if speaking too loudly would shatter the fragile remnants of her sanity. The room, once vibrant with hopes and dreams, now felt like a tomb, encapsulating the final moments of two lives intertwined by friendship and love. Clara's mind raced as she struggled to comprehend the weight of her actions. The lamp that had been the instrument of such devastation lay shattered beside her, a symbol of the violence that had erupted from her heart in a moment of overwhelming emotion. She had entered this night as a bride, filled with dreams of a new beginning, only to emerge as a murderer, haunted by the ghosts of her choices. Frenzied and panicked, she stumbled to her feet and began to pace the room, her thoughts spiraling into chaos. She grasped at straws, searching for a way to undo the damage, to restore the lives that had been irrevocably altered. The blood, dark and congealed, smeared across the floor like ink on a page, told a story of betrayal and loss. With every frantic scrub, she felt the futility of her efforts wash over her, the realization sinking in that no amount of cleaning would erase the stains of her actions. "Get a grip, Clara," she admonished herself, clenching her fists as her vision blurred with tears. She needed to think clearly, to assess the situation without letting fear dictate her next move. The weight of the truth pressed heavily on her chest, and she was acutely aware that the world beyond her hotel room was still turning, oblivious to the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. Fighting against the tide of despair, she considered her options. Should she flee, leaving everything behind in search of a fresh start? Or should she surrender to the consequences of her actions and face whatever awaited her? The thought of escaping felt intoxicating, a fleeting fantasy that offered a glimmer of hope in a seemingly hopeless situation. But deep down, she knew that running would not absolve her of the guilt that would follow her like a shadow, nor could it erase the memories of the night that had changed everything. As she stood there, the cool air of the room felt suffocating, and she was struck by the irony of it all. Just hours ago, she had been surrounded by laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the warmth of love. Now she was enveloped in a chilling silence, the echoes of her decisions reverberating around her. The walls that had once echoed with vows of love now bore witness to the tragic conclusion of a story that had begun with such promise. Clara sank to the floor, her body collapsing under the weight of grief. She buried her head in her hands, the sobs racking her frame as she tried to process the enormity of what had transpired. She thought of Nathan, of the life they had planned together, the future they had envisioned. The dreams they had shared were now nothing more than ashes, swept away by the winds of fate. In that moment of vulnerability, the reality of her isolation engulfed her. She had lost not only the man she loved, but also the friendship that had existed between Nathan and Marcus, a bond that had been forged through years of shared experiences, laughter, and unspoken understanding. Now, all that remained were the remnants of a life shattered beyond recognition. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, jolting her from her despair. Her heart raced as she thought of the consequences of her actions. What would she say if someone entered the room? How could she explain the chaos, the blood, the bodies? Panic surged anew, and she scrambled to her feet, instinctively searching for a way to hide the evidence of her crime. But as she turned, she saw the door creak open, and her breath caught in her throat. A figure appeared in the doorway, a hotel staff member, drawn by the muffled sounds of distress. Their eyes widened in horror as they took in the scene before them, and Clara felt a rush of emotions flood through her: fear, shame, and an overwhelming sense of impending doom. "What happened?" the staff member gasped, their voice trembling as they stepped into the room, taking in the blood-soaked floor and the two lifeless bodies. It was as if time had frozen, the air thick with tension as reality crashed down upon them both. Clara's mind raced. I didn't mean to. It was an accident," she stammered, but the words felt hollow, inadequate to capture the gravity of the situation. She realized that no explanation could justify the violence that had erupted in that room, the lives that had been irrevocably altered by her actions. The staff member, still in shock, reached for their phone, trembling hands dialing emergency services. "I need to call for help," they said, their voice shaky as they attempted to regain composure. But in that moment, Clara felt a growing sense of dread. Help would not come fast enough to save her from the consequences that loomed over her like a dark cloud. As sirens wailed in the distance, signaling the approach of law enforcement, Clara's thoughts spiraled further into chaos. She was acutely aware that the life she had known was slipping away, and a new, terrifying reality awaited her. The weight of her choices pressed down on her, leaving her breathless and trembling with anticipation of the unknown. She turned to the staff member, her voice trembling. "Please, you have to understand. It was a moment of rage, a mistake. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." But her pleas fell on deaf ears as the reality of her situation began to settle in. In the moments that followed, Clara felt as if she were watching her life unfold from a distance, a spectator in her own tragedy. The shadows of her choices loomed large, and she could not escape the inevitable truth. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The consequences of her actions would ripple through the lives of everyone connected to her, leaving scars that would never heal. As the police arrived and began to assess the scene, Clara felt a profound sense of despair wash over her. She was no longer the bride who had walked down the aisle, filled with dreams of love and happiness. Instead, she was a woman caught in a web of her own making, facing the grim reality of a future that had been irrevocably altered by a single tragic moment. In the aftermath of the chaos, as the officers began to ask questions and gather evidence, Clara found herself grappling with a profound sense of regret. The realization that her life was forever changed sank in, an anchor weighing her down in a sea of sorrow. There would be no returning to the life she had known, no chance to reclaim the happiness that had been so cruelly snatched away. As she sat in the back of a police car, the reality of her situation settled heavily upon her. She gazed out the window, watching the world outside continue on, blissfully unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded just moments before. The sun rose higher in the sky, casting a golden light over the city. But for Clara, the dawn of a new day felt like the closing of a chapter filled with love, dreams, and the promise of a beautiful future that had been shattered in an instant. The weight of her choices pressed down on her, and she was left to confront the haunting question: what now? The answer remained elusive, lost in the echoes of a night that would forever haunt her. As the police car pulled away, the sirens fading into the distance, Clara understood that the journey ahead would be fraught with challenges and heartache, but she had no choice but to face it, to confront the consequences of her actions and the reality of a life irrevocably changed. In the aftermath of a night filled with heartbreak, the echoes of their lives lingered, urging all who heard their story to reflect on the choices they make and the truths they hide. This tragic tale serves as a reminder of the fragility of love and the profound impact of our decisions, urging us to confront our true selves in a world that often demands we wear masks. We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments section below. And if you found this story insightful, please subscribe and leave us a like. We would really appreciate that.